Hi there, I'm Rick Vanover, and welcome to this MVP Days session. And I'm happy to present this to you. Azure Blob Storage and Backups, what everyone should know. So let's go ahead and start the slides here. And let's see if I can do this correctly. Yeah, so Azure Blob Storage and Backups, what everyone should know. Now, I've worked in backup industry for quite a while, 9 years with a leading backup vendor, and I've gone through this journey that I'm going to share with you some tips and advice that I've learned over the years that can help you in your Azure strategy in regards to backups. I'm going to highlight some things that I think you should know, some things you might already know, but also hopefully making you feel really good about what you're doing when it comes to Azure and backups. So I want to kind of start with a few mindset, reality checks. When I grew up, it was one of your biggest fears were tapes falling off the truck. Now, I think that's actually still a risk today, believe it or not. But the reality today is that with the cloud and with Azure, you know, everything is different. The security aspect of it, the amount of data, the way you manage it, how you get it there, how you get it out, how you pay for it, everything is different, right? So there are quite a few considerations that need to go into place for backups in Azure today. And in the reality of this, I actually want everyone to kind of think about some four kind of factors that go into this, right? I would argue that it's a lot like buying a car. And what I mean by that is, ask yourself, do you want high performance? Do you want a high amount of security? Do you want long retention? Now, a lot of times people say yes to that. But where it starts getting a little fuzzy is, are your needs clear? Right? And this is something I'm going to come back to here in a second. But when you think about Azure in the cloud, you can actually do all of this. You can have high performance, and I'm going to get to the menu of the different types of blob storage options that are available in Azure. The security, that's on the user, right? To configure that correctly, but I think you can have that in Azure. I think you can go confidently into the cloud. And I have some information on that I'm going to share with you in a second. And the high capacity and retention, everybody feels that's important and they want it. But if you live in an on-premises world, that's actually very difficult to achieve. And let me explain. Coming up with backup storage isn't a problem. It's coming up with the money for backup storage that's a problem because it's an upfront purchase. So if you have the situation, and to the last point, if the needs of the organization are or are not clear, you're going to walk into a very kind of tricky situation when it comes to coming into an agreement about what you need. And so I'm going to look into my Dave and Crystal Ball. Yes, Dave and Crystal Ball. I'm going to look into my Dave and Crystal Ball and make kind of a speculation here that the natural choice, all of these factors kind of walk into a situation that the cloud becomes the only feasible option to support this, mismatch of expectations of needs, unclear amounts of retention, and you have all of these options with Azure. In fact, I'll look backwards into my Dave and Crystal Ball, and I will see that in October of 2009, I wrote a blog about this very topic, saying that data protection may be the best entry for cloud storage. A full almost 10 years later, I still agree with this. When it comes to cloud storage, I mean, apps have matured and different other storage services can leverage other types of Azure storage options because it's more than just blob storage. But this is a really good way to start if you haven't done so yet. And even 10 years later, I still agree with myself, which is pretty rare. But the Dave and Crystal Ball looking forward will tell me that the only feasible option is to have Azure storage in play for that effectively infinite amount of storage that you can have. And when you think about trying to come up with an agreement about how much retention you need, you will just fall into this option where the only practical way to do this is the cloud, and Azure's there to help you. So when we look at Azure Blob Storage, I want to kind of, I don't want to say level set, but educate a bit. It's one of many storage services in Azure. In fact, this is one of the things I love about the hyperscale public cloud space right now. Every time you turn around, there's new services. Now, we don't necessarily see new storage services every day. We'll see app services or compute related services or different packagings of the two or whatever. It's a very fast moving space. Now, some of the top different Azure storages out there are file storage, disk storage, queue storage, and managed disks, and Blob. Now, Blob is effectively, from a definition standpoint, it's object storage. Okay, it is not the normal storage that we've grown up with on premises. I can't run it on my laptop without some real work. Can't, most people don't run object storage in their data center, but if they've gone down the Azure Stack route, then yes, they can, right? But just historically, it's a different type of storage and it's accessed a different way, which I'll get to in a second. But within Blob Storage, there's also these kind of different other factors, which are the service level. So when you go onto the Azure page, you see a lot of different 3-letter acronyms, or in some case, a 2 and 3-letter acronym. So let's go through what those are. LRS, locally redundant storage, which simply means that the data from an Azure standpoint is redundant locally. And then above that is zone redundant, ZRS, geographically redundant, GRS, and then read access geographically redundant storage. These are just different kind of availability levels of these blob storages. And then they also exist in other modes like premium, hot, cool, archive. And everything changes with these, right? Price changes, and then this is also affected by what region. So just a lot of factors go in there, and you can read on Azure about these, but I just want to kind of zero in that when you say Azure storage, it's which service level, and then in the case of Blob, premium, hot, cool, archive, and the other types of things exist as well, especially around SSDs and stuff like that. So you can, let's start there with Azure Blob Storage. And when you go into the cloud, one really important thing that I want to highlight to everybody is that you really need to think about something pretty important, about the cloud, about Azure, the responsibility. Now, when I say responsibility, I'm referring to the data that you're leveraging for backups in Azure. I look at putting backups in Azure, kind of a new version of, think of that truck with the tapes falling off. Imagine that the tapes didn't fall off. The operator of that truck and then the warehouse, they don't have any insight into the data, right? They shouldn't. Same thing exists in the cloud world. Now, it's a kind of a funky analogy, but I think it's really important to kind of get your head around that. If you look deeply into the shared responsibility for Azure, you'll see right at the top, data classification and accountability is in the blue box, which aligns to the cloud customer. And the same happens on-prem. So when you think about when you're going into Azure, your data is your responsibility. And that, for the backup use case, keep that in mind. And that's more than just sending backups to Azure, but that's also once you start building workloads in Azure, you still should think about the practice of backing up, right? So there's two kind of angles to this. There's, I want to store backup data in Azure. Then I have data in Azure or another cloud. I want to back it up in Azure. It still becomes the responsibility of the cloud customer. So if you haven't seen this, I really think this is important. And I stole this fair and square from a MSDN blog, which I've linked to down below. Now, when I'm talking about Azure storage as all those different services, the one that I think for backups is the most useful, most applicable for many people, it's blob storage. And a lot of times people want to know, how does blob storage work? Now, I think that this picture sets this up really well. There are two different types of storage that are very familiar with what we have grown up with, and that is file and disk storage that's designed for Azure virtual machines. So those storage services are what I would call traditional storage protocols. In fact, file storage is SMB 3.0, disk storage is a block storage resource assigned to a virtual machine. That sounds great and familiar, right? Get it, got it, good. Now, over on the left, we have what is a little bit more interesting. Some of the next generation storages, queue storage, table storage, blob storage, those are accessible from APIs. Now, I'll be the first to admit I can't even spell API. Well, I can. But what I mean by that is I'm not an individual that's going to go making portals and making calls through APIs. But what you want to think about when it comes to backup storage in Azure is that these APIs are accessible through an application. So if you're using a backup product or a backup tool, or even things like a storage gateway or other solutions like that, they're going to take care of this API for you. So don't think that just by using blob storage, you're going to walk into a new technology per se. A lot of times that's all transparent for you. But it's important to note this is accessible in this different way. And I stole this fair and square from Cloudberry Labs blog on this. So I want you to think about the next part of the content I'm going to go through here. I want to think about some what's and whys and hows. Okay, so I I kind of illustrated why I think Azure is the right option for backup storage, and that's because it's effectively infinite. With some of those factors we spoke about earlier, when you think about how much retention you might need to keep in play to be compliant to the expectations of one or more of your different stakeholders. But once I kind of identified, yes, Azure is a good candidate for it. But when we think about, okay, I'm going to leverage blob storage for backups, how does the data get in there? So the next kind of progression are some of the questions that might come up on going that way. So when I think about how does data get into Azure, that is actually, it sounds like it is a pretty straightforward thing. Just throw it up, send it up there. Well, yes, it is pretty easy to get in, but there's a few other things you want to consider. Backup data is very different, and I've spent a lot of my career, the last 9 years in my current role, explaining how this data profile is indeed different. And what I mean by different is that it's first of all big. Backup data is usually a collection of files that are images or compressed and deduped, storage efficiencies in play, that might be one or more physical servers, virtual machines, large data sets, images, that type of stuff. You have to think about this type of data. It's not unstructured, it's actually very structured. But when you go into Azure, you got to think about some factors that might come into play. So the first thing to think about is actually just getting it into Azure is easy. But there are some things that happen in the background that you might want to know about. The first of them is just simply the network. The network transfer of some of these large data profiles may be noticeable in your environment. And I think you might find yourself doing some network analysis. If you start doing backups, sending them to Azure, you might want to start having some network visibility. Oh, wow, that takes a long time. Or, oh, wow, that's adversely affecting everything else, etc. So give that some thought. The other thing that a lot of people don't think about is the last two, backup source IO and the backup windows, and I'll get to the joke in a second. The backup source IO is the gravity of this data. Again, it's usually big data, well, large data, not the conventional big data. It's usually large data, and we have to pick it up, that's a read, and put it somewhere else, right? So that aspect of the process does incur what I call source IO, so the read. Now, the process of this, depending on how you implement it, I mean, a lot of backup products do this differently. So always kind of look a little closer to what your backup product is doing when it's sending data to Azure for backups. But it might actually prohibit you from running a regular backup, and that's the impact on the backup windows, windows with a lowercase w, not windows like server, etc. So the thought is, if you've built your environment around having backups at a certain time, but depending on how these technologies move data to the cloud, does that prohibit you from actually running additional backups? Now, I think that this is very manageable if you have some visibility to the network and how in particular the different technologies are implemented. A lot of technologies will write to something on traditional storage first, and then do a post-process offload or processing to the Azure storage. That's a really kind of good approach. The ones that I would get a little cagey about are literally picking up the whole file as is and throwing it into the cloud, because I'm going to get to a second on why that's a risk. But anyways, give some thought to how you get into Azure, and then also think about how you get out of Azure. Now, I'm not going to go walk into the debates of cloud economics, but I do think you should be very aware of cloud economics. There are a number of companies that are putting cloud economists on staff, and I'm not making this up. This is a real job title. But I think the important thing here is that everyone at some point in their career will learn a little bit about what egress costs are and what they mean in some manner, and that can be a surprise. Now, I actually think the cloud cost models are very defendable for what they are, but I do think that every cloud citizen or cloud customer should go into them very aware of that as well. So let me give you an example. How much do you expect you should pay to retrieve 1 terabyte from Azure of data? Now, I just threw out that 1 terabyte number because it's like, well, I'm not going to do that every day, but I want you to be aware of this, especially in regard to what I just told you on the previous one about getting data into Azure. So backup data, again, is a funny set of data, right? It's usually larger, it's usually images, it's usually got a lot of stuff you need and or want to keep, but it also has a lot of stuff you might not necessarily need. So let me give you a very specific scenario. I need a 4K file from a backup 8 months ago. Okay, now in the on-premises world, I don't even need to think about egress costs because it's on my appliance. If the only thing I have to worry about is time, it's on my local storage. If I've gone into Azure, I need to think about two important things. One, how long is it going to take? So you think about archive, cool, hot, premium, and then you also think about the egress cost, right? So these different factors are it's just different for the cloud. So I just want you to be aware of when you put backup data in the cloud, what are you going to deal with? Now, I think that we live in a world that when data goes into Azure, it should be very smart so that when it comes out of Azure, it can do so efficiently. So if I need that 4K file, do I need to like pick up that whole 1 terabyte backup file and bring that home? So that's download bandwidth, and that's egress cost, and it's local read IO. Okay, three bad things. If I'm doing my backups intelligently with Azure, you could walk into a world where you're only bringing in the 4K file and a couple of neighboring objects around it from the blob store to reconstruct what you need. To be night and day difference in efficiency, much less cost, much less time, much less IO. Okay, so those are things I want you to think about when you pull data out of Azure. Go through the drill with your backup products. That's the only way you're going to learn this. And why I ask this is because it's very important to know this. It sets your expectations right. I mean, we've all been there when something doesn't go as planned and you have your CIO sitting over your shoulder watching you with the nervous clicky mouse trying to pull something back or fix a problem, right? When data needs to come back, especially if it's just a 4K file, we wouldn't want to explain that we're downloading a whole terabyte, etc. Something to think about. Now, that being said, I think you also can walk into a way where I think we can introduce some limits and controls. Now, limits and controls are, I think, safeguards that you can only address after the previous things that we just spoke about. So how does the data get out of Azure, these egress costs, et cetera, not just egress costs, but also the access of it. You can actually do some things to both protect it and limit it. So the first thing I want to highlight are VNet service endpoints that you can actually have firewalls within the storage account to limit the access of the blob storage to applications. So this is a very kind of good way to kind of manage your Azure blob storage. And there's two links down at the bottom that I fair and square stole this from. One is information on the storage service endpoints on Microsoft site, and the second is a blog that a colleague of mine wrote about how to limit the transfer costs out of Azure. Now that's one aspect of it, and I actually recommend having service endpoints with firewalls and storage accounts for backup storage. Again, the backup storage has always been different. We've always wanted it separated. We've always wanted it offline. We've always wanted it administered by different people, just to have different domains of failure to introduce resiliency. Very important in today's ransomware era as well. But another thing you can think about are backup application quotas. It's very likely that your backup software, if it's leveraging Azure Blob Storage, will actually allow you to say, do not put more than XYZ number of terabytes into blob storage. And that's a good kind of economic safeguard, because let me explain why that makes sense. You might just set up the option to say, yeah, I want to leverage Azure for my storage. And in my head, Azure's effectively unlimited, which it truly is. But you generally in backup softwares will set up the backup target or the storage resource, however it's leveraging Azure, separately from how you set up backup jobs. So let me walk this into a problem, because it might take a month for this to manifest itself. What if you had a backup person, a backup administrator, not necessarily yourself, right? Because there might be multiple people making backups, but leveraging the storage resource you just set up. They might set a new backup job for a ginormous virtual machine or physical server to run 5 times a day, full backups every day, retain it forever. Could be really interesting, right? And that might send a lot of data into Azure that your next month bill might be a little surprising. And that's just the storage consumption. Forget the ingress or anything taken out. So if you put this limit on the target, you can actually walk into a bit of a safeguard. Optional, but something to think about. I go back and forth on this. I think that uh, my kind of standing advice here is to think of a number, cost number, that would have your baseline of what your cloud Azure Blob Storage consumption is, and then a number that's the freak out number from your finance team, and make this as a limit right here, somewhere in between, right? Just so that realistically, this is where we live, but this is my my threshold. Something like that might be a good idea, and revisit that monthly, by the way, because again, you don't want to sacrifice availability in regards to your backup data in the interest of cost. You might want to stop and rethink, right? Let it carry on and address it later, but you can usually configure this. Now, the other thing I want to highlight about Azure Blob Storage in regards to backups is that I actually think that this is a very solid, very effective, different media type to being resilient against ransomware. And I think that a lot of organizations don't necessarily think that straight away. But I want to put a really important caveat. No single practice of any type is going to make someone completely resilient against ransomware. It's usually a combination of many things. First of which is what? It's user education. The second of which is having some form of offline or offsite storage. And I would think that the Azure storage aligns well here. Now, I do think tape is the purest, most efficient, most effective media because it's completely offline. Removable disks as well, but everyone has a story of tape letting them down, right? So if you think about Azure storage, it has a really compelling set of characteristics. One, it's isolated from a network standpoint. It's a different site. Two, it's different authentication, right? It's not your local Windows account that you're accessing this. But I would also recommend that you use different accounts for your backup storage in Azure. In fact, this is probably more important than I put it on the slide here. And what I mean by that is if you're going to Azure Blob Storage for part of your backup strategy, or even really having everything mirrored in there, I actually recommend that to be a completely isolated set of credentials, potentially even a different Azure account as well. And my thought here is that if any of your other authentication frameworks are compromised via the risk of propagation, we don't want to extend that to the blob store. So think about that. And it is a different storage type, right? If you have ransomware affecting a Windows OS and the file system, or a Linux OS and its file system, The storage of Azure is different. Now, the one thing you might want to be careful about are some of those gateway technologies, right? Because the gateway technologies extend the Windows OS or the storage protocol or the Linux OS in that storage protocol. They kind of transparently extend that to the Blob store. And there might be a whole bunch of changed items, deleted items, new items, etc. So give some thoughts to the gateways in the mix. So the last thing I want to share about that you might not have thought about when it comes to Azure for backup storage, I think that it's also a safe bet for many organizations that Azure is going to be the right cloud due to their business competitive interests. And I bring this up for those of you who are recommending solutions to people, because I know some of you have practices where you implement technologies, consult, etc. But I challenge any company that's a retail operation, distribution, any airlines in particular, cargo airlines and grocery operations, they're actually not going to be able to use the other cloud. They're only going to be able to use Azure due to their competitive interests. So I think that Azure is a safe bet, and I think that when organizations look at putting their backup data in Azure, they're going to have a good experience. So I hope you've enjoyed this session at MVP Days. Again, my name's Rick Vanover. You can yell at me on Twitter at Rick Vanover. And thank you again to the MVP Days staff for allowing me this opportunity to present.